The story of Wilfred Owen's Exposure actually starts a little bit before 1916, or even before 1918, the year it was written. We have to go all the way back to the 4th of August 1914 to really begin our story. That was the day that Britain declared war on Germany. Europe split into the Triple Alliance, which was Germany, Austro-Hungary and their friends, and the Triple Entente, that was England, France and Russia. How did this happen? On the 28th of June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in the Serbian capital of Sarajevo by an anarchist who wanted Serbian independence. This led Austria-Hungary to declare war on Serbia in retribution. Russia then declared war on Austro-Hungary because they'd vowed to protect Serbia. Germany had an alliance with Austro-Hungary, so they then declared war on Russia. Britain declared war on Germany because they had decided to invade neutral Belgium and go round through France in order to attack the French armies from behind. Britain had promised to protect Belgium and France, so by summer 1914, the world was officially at war. When war broke out in 1914, our poet Wilfred Owen was living in France, working as an English tutor. He was only 25. Owen had been born in 1893 in Shropshire. He'd always been a studious, quiet boy, and he worked for a while as a researcher for a vicar. He was an introvert who loved Keats and Shelley and felt patriotic and hopeful about the war. He completed his training as an officer in 1915, and by the time 1916 rolled around, he was in France and ready to fight. Almost immediately, the reality of the war had dawned on him. It was very, very far from what he had expected upon signing up. The weather was freezing and the conditions were absolutely hellish. Owen found himself serving in what we would now call the Battle of the Somme, mostly famous because its opening day led to the single most casualties of any opening day or any single day in British history. On the 12th of January, Owen led his platoon to defend a dugout in the middle of no man's land. 25 men were crammed into a single trench. Water began to fill up the hole, ending up 2 feet deep. Owen was not a tall man, he was 5'5", and even the tallest man had less than 4 foot of air left. Owen must have felt that he was about to drown. The worst part is, he and his platoon were left there for 50 hours. This would have destroyed some people, and I'm sure it absolutely did. But that would not be the last horrific thing that Owen was forced to do. Later that January, his platoon were ordered to defend again, but this time there was no trench. They had to lie down in the snow, half buried in it, in order to try and snipe enemy troops who were coming closer. One of his platoon froze to death next to Owen, and he had to stay beside that body for the next 2 days. What was surprising is that neither of those incidents were the one that led Owen to leave the war. He was called upon to help a member of his platoon who was experiencing extreme distress on guard duty. While Owen was walking, he fell into a newly created shell hole that hadn't been there earlier in the day. He ended up with concussion. Combined with his erratic behaviour leading up to this, his doctors declared him no longer fit for duty, and he was sent back to the UK. Once he arrived in Craig Lockhart Hospital in Scotland, Owen was diagnosed with shell shock. This is what we would now call PTSD. It was a terrible affliction, and many men of fighting age found themselves in a position where they had to cope with mental health issues where they would never have had to before. Owen's stay at Craig Lockhart proved to be a very important one in his life. He met the poet Siegfried Sassoon, who was also a patient at Craig Lockhart. Sassoon encouraged Owen with his poetry and edited the early poems he'd already prepared. As a kind of creative therapy, Owen's doctors advised him to keep writing, and he ended up editing the magazine that the hospital put out. It was this period where he had time to reflect and time to rest that he really began to grow as a poet. Unfortunately, since he'd recovered sufficiently, he was ordered to go back to the front to carry on serving his country. Once released from hospital, he found himself in Yorkshire, waiting for whatever his next assignment would be. And it was while staying in Scarborough that he sat down and wrote Exposure. Of all his poems, this is perhaps one of the most autobiographical. It refers directly to the experience he had in the Somme, which 2 years later he'd finally processed enough to talk about. The merciless east winds that knife us would have been the ones he'd experienced while out on patrol. The image of the burying party at the end could well have been who he'd seen after the assignment where he was buried in the snow. Most of that poem can be linked up directly to the letters which he sent to his mum. Of course, what he put down in the first draft of his poem is not the poem that we know from GCSE at all. In fact, he sent it to his friend Siegfried Sassoon to have a check over. Siegfried Sassoon sent him a letter back, suggesting some changes he might want to make. The masses of grey, which we might interpret now as clouds or rain, were explicitly the German army in the first draft. The awesome thing about Wilfred Owen is so many of his early drafts have survived, so we can see the delicate crossings out and alterations which he made, and the alterations he made at the request of his proofreaders. One of the great tragedies of modern literature is that Owen would never see the end of the First World War. He died almost a week before the armistice was declared. His company were asked to build a temporary bridge across a canal, and Owen was tragically killed by German gunners. His mum didn't actually find out that he died until after the armistice was declared. In his lifetime, Wilfred Owen only put together one book of poetry. He called it the Collected Poems. More has been found now, and his incomplete works, his drafts, have been put together in all kinds of books that we can see now. And it's another thread that runs through the GCSE poets. A lot of them, such as Charlotte Mew, didn't put out that much in their lifetimes. Everything was summed up by a single volume. More popular poets at the time were people like Robert Graves, who produced verse that maybe we wouldn't be as familiar with now. But over the 100 years plus since the war has finished, Owen has emerged as being the most recognisable and popular war poet of the First World War. Exposure is a lovely choice for study because it gives us a window into what was really happening for Owen, represented in literature, and hopefully serves as a fitting memorial to a young man who died before his 30th birthday, who found himself in the worst situation imaginable, serving in the First World War.